Media reporting on the now annual UN warning is awful. The faces they show are of the poorest in the world, as if it is not our faces, our jobs, and our homes that join them, as if the developed world isn't being bulldozed by climate change now. Pakistan's biblical level flood has wiped out its economy for the year, while fire, heat, and drought fallow fields, stress cities and manufacturing, and halt commerce in the major economies, all of which spell generations of fragility or decline, and it's not even headline news. Central banks and governments should be panicking over it as inflation or a looming recession. But to economists, it turns out it has no long-term consequence to economies. In fact, they have spent the 30 years since global warming loomed first into view trivializing climate change's effects on growth, and at no point have they reconsidered their outlook. This video will open a window into how economists came to erase the consequence of climate change, how their papers conflict with the actual physics of global warming, and how the real consequences of climate change are forcing painful trade-offs in existing productive capacity today and future growth beyond, when those consequences don't kill production outright. Professor Steve Keen, cited here, explains how economists erased climate change from their minds.
I haven't even got there, because what I found instead was they made simply delusional assumptions about what climate change actually is. And it's easily the worst work I've read in over half a century of critiquing neoclassical economics. What they're doing is not denying that climate change is happening. They're not total denialists like that. But they effectively deny that it actually matters. And the only way I can interpret how their brains must be working to accept the sort of assumptions they make is that neoclassical economics makes you into a zealot about a vision of capitalism as an ideal society. And you therefore spend your whole life trying to make the real world look more like your textbook. And part of that, therefore, says that capitalism can cope with anything, and therefore nothing can be a serious threat to capitalism, including global warming, and then they go about assuming the numbers to reach that conclusion. Now, this is some of the actual literature that I've read to give you an idea of just how delusional this lot are. But this is showing immediately he doesn't really understand what climate change is about. And then in doing his numerical estimates, he said that 3 degrees warming would cause about a 1/4% fall in GDP. And he was willing to pump it up to 1 or 2%. But as he said there, it's a hunch. Now, at the same time, they had two natural scientists in that survey of 18 people effectively, and their estimates were 20 to 30 times higher than mainstream economists. But rather than being shocked by that and actually exploring why, looking why scientists might be seeing far greater dangers from temperature rises than the economists were, he just simply brushed it off and never returned to the difference between what scientists were saying and what economists were saying. And the IPCC, which we tend to trust to give us the news about the likely impact of climate change, they hire the so-called experts in each field. The experts in climate are experts. The experts in economics are neoclassical economists, and you get the same nonsense coming out of it. For most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small relative to everything else. Times it'll be 3 to 4 times. But you'd be so much more wealthy you wouldn't even notice. So again, it's coming off as a trivial impact from climate change. Whereas scientists who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to the impact of temperatures like this on the sustainability of human society on the biosphere, they're terrified about 2 and 3 degrees. So this is Hansen back in 2016 saying 2 degrees is dangerous. Stefan and L saying there could be tipping cascades could start from 2 degrees and up. Lenton saying that you simply don't want to tip any of these tipping points. It's too risky to bet against them because the forces we would unleash by tipping those tipping points would be far greater than anything we'd ever do ourselves in response. And a recent paper came out and at least gave me a nice number saying 3 degrees we see as extreme climate change. In other words, do not even get there. But look what the economists are talking about, 4 degrees, 6 degrees, etc., etc. They're not in the same intellectual milieu. They're not realising the same issues as the scientists are. And yet, unfortunately, because politicians are mainly trained in economics or law, They are accepting what the economists say, and without knowing it, they're ignoring what the scientists are saying. They believe falsely, and I fell for this too initially, that the economists were taking what the scientists had said and then translating that into economic numbers and applying a high discount rate. No, they made up their own damn numbers. They made up their own models. They're not using the global circulation models that scientists have made. They're using what they call integrated assessment models, which they made up themselves, which are themselves just shot full of weaknesses.
First, to make sure people have some context of the relationship between temperature and climate change, two pieces of data.
The reason for extreme drought in so many different places is largely the same. Average air temperatures are rising and warmer air holds more water. That means less water falls to the ground and more of what does fall evaporates before reaching creeks, rivers, and reservoirs. Instead of condensing and precipitating, it stays in the atmosphere. We've talked about these changes to our hydrologic cycle before on Weathered, but it wasn't until this episode that I learned that the moisture capacity of air doesn't just go up with temperature. It goes up exponentially. So even if the rate of warming stays the same, the rate of change in our water cycle becomes faster and faster.
More likely and more intense maxima of temperatures. In other words, heat waves.
Further, for each degree Celsius the air warms, it can hold about 7% more moisture. As the Earth has warmed by about a degree Celsius since pre-industrial times, we have measured an increase in the amount of water held in the Earth's atmosphere. That has two important implications.
Firstly, because water is a greenhouse gas, the increase in humidity amplifies any warming caused by carbon dioxide, so it's a positive feedback. And secondly, more water in the atmosphere means that more precipitation, rainfall, is possible. But because the amount of energy in the system has increased, that doesn't mean that precipitation will just increase everywhere. Changes in precipitation patterns mean that while many areas will get wetter, some will get drier. And we can expect an increase in extremes on both ends, both wet and dry, as the planet warms.
So here's Khan and Mahadi's paper, and the grey area is the area of their prediction of the damages to GDP from different levels of temperature increase. We, of course, are back here at the moment, and you can just tell that is a straight linear extrapolation. They are assuming no structural change in the climate over the next 80 years. You want to test it the hard way? That's what we're going to do, thanks to these idiots.
At 1.2 degrees centigrade, we're already seeing rather dramatic effects on water supply.
And this is pretty scary because we use water for everything, from growing food, to drinking, to generating electricity and manufacturing.
Major rivers are also vital transport arteries for the three largest economies. Rivers are all affected in the developed world, but also in India, South Asia, South America, and Africa. Nobody is escaping.
The Mississippi River is drying up. Water levels are approaching record lows. Barges are getting stuck on sandbars in unprecedented numbers. Many ports and docks no longer have water deep enough for commercial boats to safely reach them. And this is a problem for the whole country.
The Mississippi River, a lot of people just think of it as this beautiful, large, historic river in the middle of the country, but really it serves as a transportation highway for a lot of industry.
The river is a critical shipping route for agriculture, oil, and building materials. And the Mississippi watershed, which includes all the creeks, streams, and lakes that feed into the Mississippi River, is the largest in the U.S.
Farmers in Iowa, they harvest their soybeans and they put them on barges and send them down to the port below New Orleans, and then it's sent to China. Chemicals are processed in Louisiana and sent upriver to the Ohio, to factories in Pittsburgh. The central part of this country thrives in part on industry moving goods and services up and down the river.
Consider the seasonal supply chain disruptions as rivers dry up. Drought and heat grow ever more acute and are spreading eastward.
Identified the 100th meridian as the approximate boundary, the line has steadily shifted eastwards to around the 98th meridian today, and it appears to only be continuing further with this eastward migration. which will begin dramatically affecting the climate of all of America's frontier cities from San Antonio in the south to Fargo in the north, which will all begin seeing less and less reliable rainfall as the century progresses, with all of the accompanying economic damages that'll entail.
In terms of surface water and groundwater supply, both the U.S. and China are making painful trade-offs between valuable cash crops, domestically needed crops, municipal and commercial water supply, hydropower, and transport. One choice can exclude several others.
Officials have already nearly drained upstream reservoirs, and then decreased release flows from Glen Canyon Dam in hopes of keeping levels above the minimum needed to produce hydropower. Yet Lake Powell's water level continues to decline. The Bureau plans to hold back 350,000 acre-feet of water over the next 4 months that would normally flow through Grand Canyon into Lake Mead. Failure to act would result in Lake Powell reaching a critical elevation of 3,525 feet above sea level as early as next month.
When you look at, the Colorado River basin as a whole, you have about 20% of the water going to municipal and industrial uses and about 80% going to agricultural uses. And when you look at the 80% of river use in agriculture, 80% of that 80% is going to alfalfa and other hay products for forage. So when you're talking about needing to reduce total system uses by 25 to 30%, it's just not possible to do unless you reduce the amount of water that's going to those different species of grass.
For example, in the U.S., water-intensive crops like alfalfa feed our cattle. Both the fodder and meat are exported. These crops crowd out many other farmers and farming towns and impact or threaten city water supplies and power generation. Las Vegas has made stunning water conservation efforts, but this has not even ensured their supply, despite purifying their gray water and banking it Lake Mead.
And Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir in the country, and a source of water for millions of people, has fallen to an unprecedented low. The lake's plummeting water level has exposed one of the reservoir's original water intake valves for the first time, officials say. The valve had been in service since 1971, but can no longer draw water, according to the Southern Nevada Water Authority.
I asked you to consider for a moment what would happen if Las Vegas or Phoenix, Arizona lost their water supply. The Colorado's flow is expected to drop by 20% in the next 30 years. A more extreme example of this kind of conflict is seen in Brazil.
Visit the Amazon, home to shit tons of biodiversity and one of the planet's biggest carbon sinks. Well, it was. Now, it's a net emitter of carbon, thanks to us. That's because we gutted our environmental agencies to help illegal loggers and miners burn and loot the forest, and helped our agribusiness mates clear the forest to grow soy and beef so they can keep making the chin-chin. Most of that beef and soy is exported for profit. Hungry Brazilians can go eat a bag of dicks. Our scientists revealed that deforestation and fires in the Amazon have surged under us, which shocked much of the world. Visit our Amazon and watch billionaires trigger one of the 9 tipping points threatening to end human civilization on the planet. Cause scientists say once we lose 25% of the Amazon, the hydrological cycle that keeps the rainforest alive will weaken to the point that it can no longer regenerate, thereby releasing the cubic fuckton of carbon it stores into the atmosphere. And since scientists have just announced that we've now lost 26% of the rainforest, we're pretty sure the Amazon won't survive another 4 years of this.
China's water crisis, in particular its crop and manufacturing issues, will severely challenge the nation and stress the global economy. While the EU and US are both taking their own endogenous hits. And remember that all of this is going on for every other economy in the world.
Is an important rice-producing area. The middle season rice of South China is now entering the flowering stage, which is a critical period for yield formation, and it is also the most sensitive period for temperature and moisture. Fields without irrigation are susceptible to high temperatures, resulting in reduced pollen activity and affecting fruit set rates. putting them at risk of severe yield reduction or crop failure. The fall grain harvest accounts for about 3/4 of China's annual grain production. Data from China's National Bureau of Statistics show that the 6 provinces covered by the Yangtze River Basin produced a combined 168 million metric tons of grain in 2021, accounting for 24.6% of the country's total production. An analysis by the Diplomat in September noted that if China's drought continues, it could also have a knock-on effect on the global economy. Once China's grain production is reduced, it could lead to higher food prices in high-income countries and food shortages in low-income countries. According to the report, for the past 20 years, Chinese government policy has encouraged peasants to maximize the production of corn, rice, and wheat in order to achieve a general level of self-sufficiency of more than 90%. With water shortages, China has engaged in large-scale groundwater extraction, particularly in the northern plains, turning the dry plains of northern China into the nation's breadbasket. However, overexploitation of groundwater, agricultural production, and chemical pollution pose a threat to groundwater. China has low per capita water availability and alarming water quality. The Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment noted in 2018 that only 19% of China's water resources are suitable for human use.
Today's China faces a different kind of challenge. Not enough of it. And it will severely inhibit the country's ambitions. In the past 20 years, 28,000 of its rivers have disappeared, equivalent to the entire basin area of the Mississippi. The flow of the Yellow River is now just 10% of what it was in the 1940s, making it the most threatened river in all of Asia. The number of dry-ups has increased rapidly. And that's just the beginning. One of the reasons China's water scarcity receives equally scarce attention is that it's well hidden in international comparisons. Only when we ask where its water is located do we really begin to understand the issue. When it comes to water, China is split in two, and the Yangtze is an inexact but useful artificial dividing line. To the south, the theme is wet. These subtropical latitudes receive lots and lots of rain. Average annual rainfall in the region is over 2,000 millimeters, most of which occurs in the summer. To the north of the Yangtze, think cold and dry. This is a temperate to arid region with only about 200 to 400 millimeters of annual rainfall. There's some rain, but not much. Just barely enough to sustain agriculture. The problem is not just where, but also when the water is located. Even what little precipitation the north does receive, it usually comes all at once, making it even less useful than these raw numbers imply. The same farm might contend with both seasonal droughts in the crucial spring months, followed by monsoon floods in July and August. And when one area experiences one, other areas are likely to simultaneously experience the other. Irregular and unpredictable weather makes planning for these extremes difficult to impossible. And to make matters worse, climate change is aggravating regional differences, making the south even wetter and the north even drier.
The trick here is that climate change can also upend expected weather patterns.
Meanwhile, in the north of China, there is concern that there is too much water. For example, in late August, affected by the substantial rainfall upstream, the guardrails of some scenic spots at the Hukou waterfall of the Yellow River have been submerged by strong flooding, causing the facilities to be temporarily closed. Flooding in the Yellow River Basin in summer and fall with such devastating effects is not what authorities want. A rare snowfall fell in the northern desert area this September. The anomalies of a major drought in the south during the flood season and flooding in the north and desert regions are worrisome. The most immediate consequence now is what will happen to China's food supply. Will there be a big shortage?
This north-south divide is the fundamental challenge facing China. Lots of water below the Yangtze not enough above it. Water, of course, is renewed in a cycle, but natural laws do not obey the economic laws of supply and demand. The two halves of China share almost equal portions of GDP, industrial output, and population, except the north holds only 20% of its water and the south 80%. You might assume that given this disparity, agriculture would be mainly concentrated in the south, but not so. 64% of total arable land and some 40% of farmland is located in the inhospitable and highly temperamental north. Put differently, the amount of fresh water per unit of farmland in the North China Plain is 15% of the country's average. The reality is that its ability to feed even itself is increasingly tenuous at best, and food is only the tip of the melting iceberg. Agriculture may account for the majority of the national water usage, but the resource it should be most fearful of is energy. It takes 24 bathtubs of water to produce 1 ton of coal, and yet 86% of its coal is produced in the north. It's true that China is actively reducing its reliance on coal, but when it comes to water, it doesn't all that much matter. 97% of its electricity requires water in one form or another, and neither oil, gas, nuclear, or hydropower is an effective solution. So while, yes, its reliance is decreasing over time, it's just not nearly fast enough. And because household use is so minuscule in comparison, water scarcity forces a trade-off between energy and food security, neither of which is palatable. Nowhere is the situation more dire than around the capital, Beijing, which makes the northern region as a whole look half serviceable. Recall that China has about 2,000 cubic meters of fresh water per person overall. Water stress is generally defined as just slightly less, 1,700 cubic meters per person. Scarcity starts at around 1,000 cubic meters, and acute scarcity around 500. Here are the per capita water resources in the country's 10 driest provinces. As of 2016, 4 were already below half the level of acute scarcity. The worst areas are in the same extreme category as Oman, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. These are Chinese government-supplied figures. Already in 2013, over half of groundwater around Beijing was level 5 or worse. Just a quarter of the total could even be treated for human consumption. These days, the vast majority of groundwater is level 4 or 5, and nearly 1/5 is worse, meaning useless. Half a century, but Mao's suggestions do not go unanswered. The equally straightforwardly named South-North Water Transfer Project began operation in 2002. The largest in the world, it consists of 2,700 miles of artificial waterways and canals designed to do one thing: move water north. The first drop of water, meanwhile, reached Beijing in 2015, 7 years after the 2008 Summer Olympics, the original goal. Now, all of these costs would be one thing if the project singularly solved China's water woes. Unfortunately, not even close. Even if it supplied only the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei area, these places would still be categorized as acutely scarce. Yet it's also responsible for 3 other provinces. Even at its imagined full capacity, it would only offset 1/4 of northern China's annual demand of 203 billion cubic meters by 2050, according to the Chinese Institute of Water Resources. In other words, decades of engineering, forced relocations, and environmental destruction all amount to, essentially, a band-aid. Perhaps worse than a band-aid, which may not heal wounds, but at least doesn't make them worse. These canals don't create water out of thin air, they merely move it, shifting the problem quite literally downstream. Southern provinces, worried about their own supply and quality of water, increasingly rely themselves on water transfer projects and dams from elsewhere. When the music stops, someone will pay the price.
The flood that devastated Pakistan is one of the most dramatic examples of the consequence of climate change. It killed 1,500, made 30 million homeless, and wiped out this year's domestic subsistence and export cash crops. Disease, starvation, and conflict will follow in its wake. For economists, how is 1.2 degrees centigrade affecting their GDP? Is it linear? Is it negligible? The reality is that climate change is also affecting the first world economies. And what we're seeing now is just the beginning of an exponential effect.
So, it's all going to fall apart. We're going to see it happen live in real time in the next decade if we're lucky. And then the question will be, who's responsible for this, for us not seeing this coming? Partially it's the fossil fuel companies, but fundamentally it's the economists who've been the arms dealers giving the fossil fuel companies the capacity to effectively plausibly deny the dangers we face. And that's why I think they're actually negligent to a point of criminality. This work should never have been published, and the people who've done it have contributed ultimately, I expect, to the collapse of human civilization.
So in no small part, thanks to economists, the very economic order they uphold is losing the pillar it stands on, its ability to grow. The shortest way to say this is that climate change equals economic death. Any conversation that does not address this is an inconsequential joke. Climate change, inflation, recession, and the death of economic growth should all be used in the same sentence. Climate change is destroying the world economy, and every politician, central banker, and economist should be challenged how much more destruction they're going to tolerate before it's addressed.